Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the next episode of the Academic Room, where lecturers share practical tips with each other. And today, we are very lucky to have the amazing Chris Jones here. Hi, Chris. Thank you very much for accepting my invitation.
Hello, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure. We've not spoken for a while
I
since you came
know,
into my classroom.
and how I know Chris, just to give some context, that I was a guest lecturer years ago at one of your programs at Pearson College, which is now Escape Studios, right?
It is, yes.
And you were a lecturer there for years before going freelance. And this is why I wanted to invite you, because I noted back then that obviously that module was about students starting their own business, and it was so practitioner. It was such a practitioner approach. And this would be my first question. You are a practitioner, and all your teaching is very much practitioner based, but still we need to share some frameworks and principles and theory with students. So how do you do that? How do you share something which is more theoretical than practitioner? What do you do then?
Yes, I think obviously it depends on which framework you're trying to teach. But what I find really useful is it's like there's a reason people invented these frameworks. But if you try and skip people all the way to here's a framework, then they start using it the wrong way. So the reason people invented these frameworks is because if you just try and run headlong into a problem and look at everything in every direction all at once, that isn't a very systematic way of approaching the problem. It's usually not the best way to organize your thoughts. And if you haven't got very organized thoughts, then you can't have very clever insights, and then you can't get the answers very well and things like that. So, but if you introduce a framework completely from scratch, then what students do is they start trying to backfill the framework so that the exercise becomes not let's look for interesting things using the framework. It becomes how can we fill the framework in, and it becomes like a form. So what I try and do instead is produce the problem first. It's like, okay, cool. So we need to, so say like something like Porter's five forces is like it's clearly a framework. It's got a diagram. It's very obviously a business framework. You can start that off by saying, okay, well, if we're going to move into an industry, which industry are you going to focus on? What's going to be your niche? How are you going to separate yourself out? Are you going to look at all of hotels, or are you just going to look at just a B&B, just catering to your area? What are you going to do, say? And then you say, okay, well, what are the kind of things that are going to be involved? And you sort of look at things like your suppliers, because you have to get stuff in from your suppliers, and your buyers are going to be very important. Okay, cool. And then gradually you sort of allow them to put the framework together themselves. And it's quite labor intensive as a teacher, because you're kind of doing an ad lib routine where you need them. Well, you don't need them, but you want them to land roughly in the same place so you can use all your lesson materials. But by allowing them to discover it, then that works really well. We do the same thing with stakeholder analysis. Oh well, these guys, how much? So what can these guys do? Why should we pay attention to this? Because they've got a lot of power. Okay, that's interesting. And then what about these guys? Oh, they're really interested, but they haven't really got much power. And then gradually you build the power interest matrix, and then students go, oh, that's a really interesting thing. We can now use it to organize our thoughts and stuff like that. So it's more of, I mean, you have to kind of speed them up so it doesn't take 50 years of management science to get them to the same place, but you can kind of nudge them into finding, or at least finding the need for a framework. And then you can say, well, if you want some way of organizing this, try this framework or that framework.
You have about groups of 20 or 30 students. How do you make sure that they can all follow you? How do you check if they all understood? What if someone is a bit behind? How do you make sure that everybody's on the same page?
Yeah, so that's very tricky, and it's tricky in different ways with different topics. So with theory, checking someone's understanding is really, really tricky, because you have to actually see them understand it. So that's quite hard. Quite a lot of the little exercise that I do in classes, I get people to go and research. I say, quick, go on to BBC News or CNN or any news site and find me some news examples where this theory applies.
Mhm.
And we'll probably talk about it later, but I use Google Slides a lot to do interactive classes. The students can then put what they've researched, just screenshot it and dump it onto the slides. And then I can go through the slides, and the good examples I can pick out and talk about. And the bad examples, I don't pick out and say, "Oh, you're wrong" in the class, because that's really stressful. But I just can brush over them, or I can bring them up, but I can bring them up anonymous. It's like, "Oh, this is an interesting one. Maybe we'll talk about this later," and then I'll move on. So I'm not going around the classroom one at a time. So people are just terrified of when it gets to their turn. I'm just picking out the good ones. So if I pull out one that's a good example, the person who said it or put it on the slides knows they've got the answer right, because, oh, Chris has chosen it to talk about, so I must have got the answer right. So I can now talk about it more easily. But finding examples of it in the real world is like the key. I've actually got a video that I made for the students once about finding a duck, and it's like, if I explain to you what a duck is, and it's this amphibious bird that lives in ponds and looks like this and has a bill, and then I sit, that's fine. You could take all the notes and you could be paying attention and you could be nodding along, but I don't know if you understand what a duck is. But if I send you out into the wilderness and say, go and get me a duck, and you come back with a pigeon, I know you didn't understand what a duck is. Come back with a chicken, I know you didn't understand what a duck is. Come back with a swan, I'm going to go, oh, okay, fair enough. It is technically part of the duck family. That's a really interesting case. So by getting them to pull back the examples, that helps with understanding or checking understanding.
Students love you, really. It's really, really good. You mentioned in one of your posts that you're really in favor of teaching experiments, that you are experimenting with things. So what are some of the experiments that you can share with us that were, and you can also share some which didn't, that is also something we can learn from.
Yeah, so I think that the teaching experiments is, it's continually trying something new. So but there needs to be a certain rapport with the students to do that. So if you've got students for a little while, I've got them for a 10-week course or something like that, then you can get a certain amount of trust from the students, and then you can say, I'm going to try this new thing, and it might not work. And if it doesn't work, then they'll go, oh, well, never mind, it didn't work. But everybody's on the same page that this is the first time I've tried something, I've not done it before. A recent one I did was, I teach pitching, like elevator pitches and that kind of pitching. So I got a very, very short pitch. And then I used ChatGPT to rewrite it in the style of, let me think, it was Barack Obama, Optimus Prime, Mickey Mouse, a Valley Girl, a tech bro. And I just went through every single like different kind of presentation style I could think of, and then got them each to use that particular style. And then we looked at what was the benefits of each one and the negatives. Obviously, some are more negative than others, but it's quite interesting because, like, Mickey Mouse, very, very positive. So if you want to add positivity, you can dribble a little bit of Mickey Mouse in around your TED Talk style talk. But that was obviously ChatGPT is a fairly new tool. I mean, I've been using it for about 2 or 3 years, but that use of it I'd never done before. So I had to go, look, we're going to try it out. And it kind of makes everybody like, no one's worried about making a mistake, because it means that, because I've kind of set the scene of this might go horribly, horribly wrong. And then once it works, you can get the feedback. And that's the key thing with my experiments. I run what's called a stop, start, continue questionnaire, continuously, all the time. A stop, start, and continue questionnaire. And it's just a Google form, 3 questions. What should I stop doing? What should I start doing? What should I continue doing? It's anonymous. There's a QR code on the screen at most of the lectures, or in an email or on the OLE or wherever. And anything that I'm doing, students can come on and say, I'm on this course, and that's the only thing you have to fill in, which course you're on. And then what should I stop doing? What should I start doing? What should I continue doing? Marking systems and all kinds of peer-to-peer reward modeling type mathematical systems that I've built in the past, and they're much more technical. I don't know which experiments you meant, if it's more my classroom experiments or the kind of marking ones.
And you get also the marking one. That's also interesting how it works. Yeah, both.
Yeah. So that's a relatively recent one, and that's an ongoing, not for summative, but for formative feedback. So just sort of mocks and things like that. When the students wrote their essays, they wanted more feedback. But to give more feedback, I have to spend longer doing the feedback, and that means I can't do it as much. And then by the time they get the feedback back, they've already got to hand in the essay, so they get really frustrated. So instead, I built a Google document for every student, which sounds arduous, but it's just 3 or 4 lines of code. So every student had a Google document, which was shared with them and me, just individually. So 2 people can see this document, me and the student, and then they can write their essay in the Google document. So I can see them writing their essay as the term goes on. So I can see them building it, which actually turned out to be a really useful thing to do anyway, because people with nothing in the Google document, I can say you've not started yet, and we're on halfway through the term. And they could just dump research in. And I could just see their working process, which I think given that the AI is building essays quite quickly now, and not brilliant essays, but you can see a point where it's not going to be hard to use an LLM to get like a third or a 2-2 on certain subjects. So being able to see the process is actually, I think, going to be much more important going forward. So being able to see this live document updating with their work was really good. But then because I had access to this document, I then started going through the document, looking for any new paragraphs or any things that's changed, packaging that up into a little HTML request and sending that to ChatGPT, to Gemini, to Claude, with comments on it saying, can you provide useful grammatical feedback or useful feedback for this student? And it would bring back a response and add it as a comment labeled RoboChris. It's the robot version of me. They all had some context windows of what the assessment was and what the students were, and a lot of examples of my comments. It kind of got the style of how I write. And it would bring back a comment and it would add the comment in, and then I would see those comments. So I was keeping an eye on it. And sometimes it got it wrong, and I had to add a counter comment saying, RoboChris has kind of got the wrong end of the stick here. He's marking this as though you've finished it, but it's only week 3 of 10. So I'm not expecting the level of detail that he's asking for, because I know it's halfway through the term. But sometimes it was really good. And it was pointing out like ways students could write it better, or ways they can make their sentences shift. The interesting thing is some of the comments it comes up with are really insightful, because it can spot gaps in conceptual space. So it knows that the student has filled in an area over here, and it knows it fills an area over here, and it can see that there's a gap in the middle. Not because it's particularly clever, but just because the pattern is 1, 2, 3, and they've got 1 and 3, so they've spotted that 2 is missing, and it'll tell it that. Gemini is pretty good for that, I think, because Google's used to find things you don't know, so it's much better at spotting stuff that's missing. So different AIs had different strengths and weaknesses, but again, only for formative and only with me supervising. So it almost like there was still a kind of regular morning routine I was in of checking how it used to run overnight, because it's much cheaper to run your LLMs asynchronously. So every night it'd turn on, check all the students' work, give them marks, and then the next morning I'd come through, read what he did, got like a little report, and that just allowed me to like very quickly keep tabs on him or them by the end, because there's like 5 or 6 different agents. But again, I would never, at least at the moment, I wouldn't be very confident letting an AI actually mark a substantial piece of work.
But that would be good for the future. It's a very good start, and I'm very happy we talk about it, because it really speeds up the process. And you're right, we are basically, if we teach something over years, then we've given a lot of feedback, which is very similar, because obviously students will have similar questions and will go similar ways in terms of like how we give feedback. And yeah, that is there for AI to give them instead of us. So I really like that. And in terms of feedback, to build a rapport with the students in order to come up with all these things. So let's talk a bit about that. So when you meet the new cohort, how do you make sure that you have a mutual trust and respect? How do you build those relationships and rapport?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's one that I'm not. I don't tend to focus on purposely, because I think if you do it too much, then it can come off as insincere. But one thing, obviously, there's all the usual ones like trying to remember people's names and call them by their names and stuff like that. The classic of a little map where people sit. If people sit in the same place, you can kind of keep notes of when you do get names and stuff, or you can try and learn people's names. I'm still not particularly, I'm much better remembering people's projects, because everyone's an entrepreneur in some of my courses. So I'm like, oh yeah, nail salon, delivery company, this. I know everybody's work, and I know all the stuff they've been working on. But that's one that what I kind of struggle with. What I found really useful was an idea. I can't remember who it's by, but I'll try and put the details in the description for you. It's this idea called unconditional positive regard, which is you always assume that the students are there to learn, they're trying hard, they're doing their best. Then so it's kind of, rather than saying, well, they'll just do this, or just assuming that the students aren't doing their best or aren't trying or aren't like, I'll always assume someone is like maybe they've like had childcare issues this morning, or maybe they've had to work late, or maybe whatever. That's why they're not quite on the ball this morning, rather than immediately jumping to, well, you're just lazy, because that doesn't really help, and it gives you and I think the students can feel that. Like if you're saying like, look, as far as I'm concerned, I think you should be able to do this. If you can't, or if you're struggling, or if you're not engaging, there's probably a decent reason why, and maybe I can help with that reason, or maybe it's just something that you can deal, like you're going to have to deal with. But at least trying to keep in mind there's an awful lot of stuff going on under the surface that we as teachers just don't see. It happened particularly in COVID. I'd have people with all their webcams turned off, and occasionally there'd be some reason for them to turn the webcam on, and you'd see that like this 18-year-old, because of the situation of COVID, had to go home and was now on the bottom bunk of a bunk bed with his 14-year-old brother or sister on the top of the bunk bed, who's now at school on Zoom on the same internet connection, and they're both shouting, and they've both got their headphones on, and they're trying to listen to what's being said. And that you suddenly realize, oh, actually, yeah, that's why I'm in this lovely little quiet room where I'm teaching, asking them to pay attention, but they're trying to drown out everything. It's taking everything they can just to listen to what I'm saying. So I always try and keep that in the back of my mind of like, the students are trying really hard to get the information in. They're really trying, at least most of the time.
Okay.
So I try and keep that in my head. Like it's hard to sometimes keep it in your head, but that unconditional positive regard, I think, gives a certain amount of trust to the students.
But love
and hopefully you get that back. And it's the transparency thing, the feedback thing. Like it's I trust you to be able to tell you that I'm not sure about something, or that I'm trying something new. If we're looking at a brand new theory or a brand new example of a theory, and someone says, "But what about if this happens in trademark law?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm not an expert in trademark law. We'll have to find it out, and we can go and find it out, or I can say maybe that's one to come back with next week." So it's like I expect them to treat me the same way. So if I come in late, or if I've said I'll put something on the OLE and I've forgotten to put something on the OLE, assume that I wanted to do it and I wasn't just being lazy. I just got, there was I had to pick the kids from school, or I had to go and do something, or something happened that meant I couldn't do it. And I think that kind of goes both ways, so that you get a certain amount of respect both ways. And once you've got that, you can trust students to do a lot more. So it's like if someone comes in late, generally I'd rather them come in late than not come in. So if someone's like 10 minutes late, I don't want them to think, oh, I'm 10 minutes late, that'll be a faff, I'll just skip the whole 90-minute seminar. I'd rather them come in and miss 10 minutes. So I won't mention it when they come in, but I also won't wait for them. So I'll start at the like about 5-10 minutes after the usual start time, because people have to physically come into the classroom. But I will start the lesson when I start the lesson. And if you come in, you'll have to catch up by talking to people during the group exercises. But I'm not going to call you out on it and say, oh, well done, finally you've arrived, or anything, because that just unnecessarily adds friction to getting the students to engage in the class.
No, that is really, really good. But let's talk a bit about when you have all this assuming good intention, which is really great. What do you do with students who continuously distract others, who are really, who are problematic? I don't know if you had cases like that. How do you deal with those?
Yeah, I've been really lucky in that I think generally my classes have never had a particularly large disruptive element in them. I've had groups where during the group work, a small cohort will be talking about something that isn't the group work, and that's always a case of how much I can go over, and usually because they respect the fact that I'm paying attention to them, if I go over and start asking about the group task, they'll immediately switch back to the group task and start doing it. So it's not really an issue. But if they're getting louder to the point where they're disrupting the rest of the class, because I'm trying to get the class to run, I can say, guys, everyone's trying to get this task done. You are being a bit noisy. And because of that relationship, they'll kind of go, oh, sorry. So yeah, we'll calm down. I've done a few classes, particularly when I've been freelancing. I don't get time to build up that rapport. So I'm kind of stuck then, because if someone is being disruptive and I go over and do my usual thing, and then they don't calm down, I can either do the dad voice of saying, look, guys, you have to be quiet, and then they go, right? But that just tweaking up the aggression level or the confrontational level a little bit then puts you on guard for the rest of the lesson, because you're always thinking, like, you're always then keeping an eye and seeing if it's escalating, or getting back to them and thinking, okay, if they don't then quieten down, what's the next step? How can I escalate this?
Yeah.
Other than like asking them to leave or something like that. So that then puts the whole lesson on a back foot, because there's a lot of tension and a lot of confrontation. But if you are in a new class and you've only got one lesson, you also don't want them to distract the rest of the class. And actually, and I know this because in the feedback form, people say you could have been a bit more in control of some of the students who were making more noise because we couldn't really hear you. And part of that was
use AI to write the whole essay.
Yeah, so it's again that mix of practical mixed with theory. So I try and teach the students how the AI works underneath. I've been writing machine learning algorithms for many years. I'm a computer programmer by sort of my background, so I really understand how they work underneath. And I think if you understand that, then you can kind of see where they would be strong and where they would be weak. And also I try and give lots and lots of examples. So I'll use AI in the class for doing stuff, but I won't just say, look at this amazing example case study that I did. I'll say, this is a case study that I produced with AI, and here's why I chose to use AI, and here's why it's done a good job, and here's where it went a bit wrong. And rather than just sharing the document, I'll share the conversation so they can see the back and forth I had. And I think demonstrating like good behavior by example is key. But also, you kind of, the student, in the same way I want the students to use a spell checker, I kind of want the students to use AI, but I want them to use it to make their work better. So I think maybe there might be a shift of expectations. Like if you're just coming up with generic dross, then you're not going to get particularly good marks. And that's what AI generally comes up with. So I don't have to mark you down because you used AI. I have to mark you down because it didn't produce a very good piece of work. And I think the biggest thing with that is maybe shifting. It might be a thing with assessments. I do obviously a lot of formative feedback and stuff, so I can see them literally writing it themselves rather than copying chunks in with that Google document. But if I couldn't do that, I'd aim for, you want basically, if you've got something where you're not quite sure how to use it, you want to be able to make mistakes safely. So you really want to have low stakes but summative but low stakes assessments quite early on, so that a student can use AI to produce the whole thing and get a really bad mark, and that bloody nose kind of goes, oh, okay, I clearly didn't use it very well there. But then they can do it again, and if it's only a few percentage of the overall grade, there's a little bit of risk, but they can take a bit of a stretch. I heard a lot of students just say, I'm just not using AI. I'm not using AI at all, because that way I definitely can't get done for plagiarism because I didn't use it at all. And it's like, well, yes, but if you do use it, it could spot some of the problems you've got. Like you've got sentences that are 33 words long. The AI would spot that and say, and say, break this sentence down a little bit, and it would show you how to break it down. Especially if you've got English as a second language, I think that could be really, really useful. But you just have to make sure that you're in the driving seat of the thing, and you are using it like an intern to help you produce the thing that you want to produce. And the problem with
that you use, can you just share with us some tools you use for teaching? You mentioned Google Slides, you mentioned Google Docs. What else do you use and would recommend?
Yeah, so Google Slides is like my main go-to tool. I use it obviously for slides. If you're in a seminar, a lot more stuff is interactive. But during COVID, it's very hard to interact over the internet through a webcam and everything else. So what I did was I built my slide deck into Google Slides, and then I could share the Google Slides with all the other students just with a link, and they're all looking at the same slides. So I've got my screen share on and I'm clicking through them like usual, but I can also say we're on slide 15, and then anybody that doesn't have a very good internet connection can just scroll down to slide 15 or slide through a PDF downloaded. I can also use the comments at the bottom of the Google Slides. So what I'm saying about the slide, I can put as a paragraph of text in the comments. So if you can't hear me over the internet connection, or if you can't hear me in class, or if English is your second language and I speak very fast, you can at least keep an eye on what I'm doing underneath by reading the comments. It's not exactly word for word, but it means I can use slides that are quite abstract. Like I could just have I've got a slide that's just a tiny mince pie and then a medium-sized mince pie and then the Guinness World Record mince pie. And it's about buying shares in startups and growing your investment in a startup until it becomes a big company. And you still got the same size slice, but it's in a much bigger pie. And that the slide on its own, I think, is much better as just images. And then I can bring the images up one at a time and I can talk through the stages of startup growth. But if you are reading it online, if you're reading it afterwards, the slide makes no sense. So underneath in the comments, it explains why these 3 pictures are on the slide. It does lots of things like getting rid of death by PowerPoint, because you're never going to be just reading from a slide because there's no text on the slide. You have to say it all, but you still get the benefits of the students can use the slide afterwards as a resource. The other thing like Google Slides is I make a different instance of the slides. So I might have AI lecture in my folder, like AI canned lecture, but then every time I give that lecture, I make a copy, and it's Tuesday 15th, South London. That's your copy of the slides, but it's your class's copy of the slides. So if you come up with a question and I say, you know what, there's a really interesting article about this, and I grab the article, I can just paste in another slide. And if anyone has any questions, they can just add comments to the slides while I'm doing them. And then after this lecture, I can go back and I can answer all the comments. And it's like, if you're not confident enough to put your hand up in the middle of the lesson, or if it's a really interesting part of the lecture, I would hope anyway, and you don't want to interrupt with a question, but you have a question, you can just add a comment to the slides. And then afterwards, I get a big email list of as added comment, anonymous aardvark has added comment, anonymous bear has added comment, all these people. And the way I usually link that through is just to put a QR code on the first slide, or put a little QR code in the corner of every slide, so it's always on the screen. And then I can also integrate my workshop type stuff into the slides. So we get to some lessons and a slide comes up and it says, what is innovation? And on the slide is loads of blank post-it notes, like little yellow boxes. And the slide's empty, there's nothing on there. So then I can say to the students, okay, what is innovation? And they can add information to the post-it notes and it'll update on my screen at the front. Or they can just shout it out and I'll add it in on my platform. And that means that the ones who want to shout out, the confident ones who go, yeah, it's Steve Jobs, he's innovation. It's like, yeah, Steve Jobs, very good example of innovation. Type in Steve Jobs and stick it up. And that would be something I'd do on the board. Like if I was physically there, or if I was in an old-fashioned classroom.
I could see that.
Yeah, write it on the board as a post-it note. But if you're not very confident, you can just type it in on your screen and it comes up. And then I can say, oh, yeah, data literacy. That's a really good point about innovation. It's very hard to be innovative without data literacy. And then if I want to, I can say, who said that? And then I can look around the class and someone go, oh, it was me. It's like, that's a really good point. That's a really, really good point. And then
it's really evident why students love you. And thank you so much for sharing generously so many, many, many great things. Thanks a lot. I will add all the links into the bio. Please, everybody, connect with Chris Jones on LinkedIn. I will also add this LinkedIn link, and chenjones.com, where you can find information very soon about the AI training that you deliver to professionals as well as now you're being a freelancer. So thank you very much for being here at the Academic Room. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and please come back to the next episode. Thank you, Chris. Goodbye.
Thank you very much for having me.